Good day, students, human resource management students that would be. This is Jeanne Doonan. Welcome to our first lecture online for our actually on-ground class. We're going to be covering Chapter 10 in this lecture, which would have been what we would have covered on March 17th and March 19th. So you can stop it at any point in time that you want and pick up again at your leisure. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I thought it'd be a good idea to read the learning outcomes for our chapters while we're doing these online, so here we go. We're going to, we're going to describe the purposes of performance appraisal in organizations. We're going to summarize the performance appraisal process in organizations. Identify and describe the most common methods that managers use for performance appraisal. Discuss other general issues involving performance appraisal in organizations, and this will continue into the next slide. I just noticed from the previous slide that I had a black cat on one side, so beware, there may be animals that crawl around me or near me or say something next to me, so please forgive me. So as we continue with the learning objectives here, we're going to describe the nature of careers in organizations, discuss human resource management and career management, and identify and discuss basic career development issues and challenges. So first we're going to talk about performance appraisal and performance management, and we'll divide it into two different areas. First, we'll talk about performance appraisal, which is, as stated on the slide, specific and formal evaluation of an employee to determine the degree to which the employee is performing their job effectively. It's also called various terms such as performance evaluation, performance review, annual review, employee appraisal, and employee evaluation. We're also looking at performance management and the difference there. It's a general set of activities carried out by the organization to change or improve employee performance. So although performance management typically relies heavily on performance appraisals, performance management is a broader and more encompassing process. It's the ultimate goal of all of the performance appraisal activities. It's a whole process. So what is the importance of performance appraisal? Well, first off, it provides a benchmark to assess the adequacy of recruitment and selection processes. What we mean by that is that the appraisal results help managers to assess the extent to which they are actually recruiting and selecting the most appropriate employees. So if they're selecting the most appropriate employees, then it gets to time to evaluate them as long as they're coaching them and giving them the information that they need to do their job, and they don't have questions and things are going along just fine, then a good hiring decision would equate to a good performance review, in theory at least. We also need performance appraisals for legal reasons. Organizations must be able to demonstrate that their promotions, their transfers, their terminations, and reward allocations are based on merit, as opposed to discriminatory factors such as gender or race. It must be based on productivity reasons as to why they're actually being promoted, because they adequately meet the needs of the position as opposed to some other sort of bias. Performance appraisals play a role as part of the larger performance management process. So the goal of performance management is to improve employee performance. Part of this process is letting employees know how well they are currently doing so that they can correct their deficiencies and then capitalize on their strengths and improve their overall contributions to their jobs. Performance appraisals should provide this information to employees. Also, performance appraisals are used as a basis for incentive pay systems designed to improve motivation and performance. So what are some of the goals of performance appraisal? What are the goals? Well, one thing would be to provide a valid and reliable measure of employee performance along relevant dimensions. So in other words, the appraisal results should reflect the true picture of who is and who is not performing well. And they should indicate the areas of specific strengths and weaknesses for each person being rated. Another reason we use it is simply because we need the documentation. It's important to document your individual individual performance and have that record. Ideally, would be placed in the person's personnel file. Also, another goal of performance appraisal is to improve job performance. It requires that employees receive accurate feedback and guidance. So improving individual job performance requires that employees receive useful and accurate feedback about their current job performance, as well as guidance on how they can improve their performance. So what are the major steps in the performance appraisal process? Well, first of all, we need to establish the job duties, and we talked about how we go about doing that. We have job studies, and from those job studies, we develop those job descriptions and the job specifications that we talked about in our in-class exercise. Then we establish and communicate what those performance standards are. So the organization has to be sure that everyone rates performance using the same set of standards, and that employees know what is expected of them. Consistency is the rule for performance standards. Then managers need to inspect or observe performance. Others might observe performance and rate as well, but primarily it's typically seen as the supervisor. It's a good idea for the employee to keep records as well of their own performance. Document or record the observed performance, so that's what they're doing after they're inspecting or observing performance. They document or record the observed performance. And then last but not least, then they would rate the performance at the final performance review process. So there's various roles of various people in the performance appraisal process. First, there's the role of the organization, because they have to develop a consistent appraisal process. They have to determine the timing of the appraisals, and they have to ensure the availability of clear and specific standards. So how that works is how will the information gained from performance appraisals be used? For example, will it be developmental feedback, merit pay, or other outcomes? Obviously important is that everyone understands exactly how the ratings are going to be used and exactly how they will be used, what they're going to be used for and how they're going to be used. The organization should also ensure that these standards are communicated carefully to the employee so that everyone is very sure of what these performance appraisals mean. The organization must ensure that everyone rates performance using the same set of standards and that employees know what is expected of them. Then there's the role of the rater, the person who's going to be evaluating the performance. They observe performance and process information gained from observation. They communicate the results and consequences to the ratee, and they prepare the ratee to perform at desired levels. So in other words, the supervisor must be sure that the employee knows what's required on the job, has the needed skills, and is motivated to perform the job at the level that is desired by the organization. In terms of the roles in the performance appraisal process, we continue on with the role of the ratee, the person who is being rated. That person needs to maintain a clear and unbiased view of their performance. It has to be very objective. As much as we want to give ourselves a pat on the back, we have to also realize we have pros and cons to our performance. We need to make sure we collect adequate information to avoid disagreements during the process so that problems don't arise. So because problems can occur during the appraisal process if there's disagreement between the rater and the ratee, so it is essential that both parties have all the information they can collect about the ratee's performance. This approach should allow the ratee to be more receptive to feedback from the rater, especially if it is something negative. Sorry about the cat. Which in turn makes it more likely that the ratee will change his or her behavior in response to the feedback. And we need to be receptive to feedback from the rater. The rater should be giving us hardcore examples of things that have happened in our performance, and we need to be receptive to that as well. It doesn't mean we have to always agree, but we have to be open. So there are various sources of information for performance appraisals that we can get feedback from as employees. One would be our supervisor. That person's the most likely rater because the supervisors usually have the most knowledge about the job requirements and the most opportunities to observe the employee's performance on the job. They're also responsible anyway for the performance of his or her subordinates, so they need to be aware of what the performance aspects are. As you can hear, we have multiple cats, sorry. Next, peers. Peers here are people that we work with, like our coworkers that don't supervise us, but may have a say in our how we've been performing if they work with us. An advantage of using peers in such a process is that they have expert knowledge of job content and also may have more opportunities than the supervisor has to observe the performance of a given worker on a day-to-day basis. Another one would be subordinates. That means people that work for us if we have anyone who reports directly for us. It's a especially important source of information when the performance of their own manager is being evaluated, and this information is perhaps most useful when the performance appraisal is focused on the manager's leadership potential. Then we look at self-appraisal, the self-appraisal process. Although few organizations rely on self-evaluations for decision-making, it is often useful to have the rater, or the ratee, consider his or her own performance, as part of the overall appraisal process. Another one would be customers. In some cases, like people who work for Chili's or Red Lobster, the customers are formally brought into the process when they fill out feedback forms or respond to mail surveys after using the services of the organization. Another area they don't talk about is using multiple performance appraisal feedback opportunities, like 360-degree feedback. For example, I received 360-degree feedback one year, so it didn't just come from my manager, it came from other managers outside the organization, outside of the city HR department. So it was managers in the city of Kalamazoo, but they were not in my department, and how I worked with them, as well as peers that I worked with, my coworkers. So I had three major sets of feedback. That's known as 360-degree feedback, and it can be quite useful because it can be different from each source depending on how they work with you. Okay, so now we need to discuss decisions regarding the design of the appraisal system. First of all, we have to ask what elements of performance should be rated. Should it be based more on the needs of the organization? Usually it should be, and then that would be based on the choice of the rating instrument, and would include three main factors. So again, it should be based more on the needs of the organization than on the choice of rating instrument, and include three main factors. Traits. Traits are abstract properties of individuals that generally cannot be observed directly, but can be inferred from behavior. That is, their attitude, their leadership, their initiative. The approach is based on the assumption that similar traits underlie effective performance for all jobs. Then we have behaviors. Behaviors tend to be based on job analysis and tend to be tailored to specific jobs. For example, the ratee may be evaluated on how well they follow up in specific sales leads. This may seem objective because we're evaluating behaviors that can be observed. And then we have outcomes. For example, an organization can tally actual sales. It's the most objective performance measure, and it's usually tied to specific goals. So outcomes is a big or a heavy emphasis normally in performance reviews. Now the question is, who should be rated in the work teams? The organization must decide whether to evaluate individual performance or team performance. With work teams, organizations must decide whether to evaluate individual performance or team performance, and this issue can become quite complicated. If individuals are rated and rewarded based on their individual performance, they have less reason to cooperate with other team members to accomplish the team's goals. So in other team settings, though, it is critical that other team members work together toward a common goal. In these cases, it's critical that performance be measured and evaluated only at the team level. Okay, now we're going to talk about various methods for appraising performance. There's one called a simple ranking method. Actually, all the next ones I'm going to talk about in this slide are types of ranking methods. But this simple ranking method is when a manager gives a rank order to each member of a particular work group from top to bottom, or from best to worst performer. The next one is a paired comparison method. That's when each individual employee is compared with every other individual employee, 2 at a time. This technique is simply an alternate way to generate rankings, basically. Then there's one called a forced distribution method. Groups of employees are put into predefined frequencies of performance ratings. So these frequencies are determined by the organization in advance and are imposed by the rater. For example, if 20% of all employees are not performing to standard, 60% are meeting expectations and standards, and 20% are truly outstanding, managers can then classify their employees with any one of these 3 groups, either below standard, at standard, or above standard. But the percentages assigned to each group must be specified in a forced distribution method when it's forced. The forced distribution method results in a normal distribution of rating, which may be seen as fair. From the organization's perspective, and employees are to receive merit pay increases, this ensures control over how much money is spent when it's a forced distribution. So how much money is going to be spent on merit pay. But all employees may be performing acceptably, so most organizations rely on some type of absolute judgment and employ a system of performance ratings rather than these rankings. Because sometimes you're going to have more than 20 or more than 60% of your people performing at standard. You may have more than 20% performing at standard or above standard, and you may have less than 20% performing below standard. And so the forced distribution method can be difficult in that case. I apologize for the background noise. I think we should be able to get through this and be able to hear me. Other methods for appraising performance are specific rating methods, not ranking, but rating. One type is called a graphic rating scale. It's a statement or question about some aspect of an individual's job performance. For example, one common set of responses to a graphic rating scale might be 1 is strongly agree, 2 is agree, 3 is neither agree or disagree, 4 is disagree, and 5 is strongly disagree. Another method is the critical incident method. This relies on instances of especially good or poor performance on the part of the employee. So this requires raters to recall such instances on the job and then describe what the employee did or did not do that led to their success or failure for their critical incident method. And then we have the behavioral anchored rating scale, or BARS as it's called. It's a combination of the graphic rating scale and the critical incident method. It's a complicated and often expensive process to use. A BARS system has a significant advantage of dramatically increasing reliability by providing specific behavior examples to reflect effective and less effective behaviors. Additional methods for appraising performance include the behavioral observation scale, also known as BOSS. It's developed from critical incidents like a BARS, but uses more critical incidents to define specifically all measures necessary for effective performance. Also, unlike BARS, BOSS allows managers to rate the frequency with which the individual has exhibited each behavior during the rating period. The manager then averages these ratings and then calculates an overall performance rating for the individual. However, it takes more time to develop the BOSS system than the BARS system, and it can be even more expensive. Another system is management by objective system, something that's been used at the city. It's based largely on the extent to which individuals meet their personal performance objectives. This is where the subordinate or the employee meets with his or her manager, and together they set goals for the subordinate for a coming period. Often it's a year, and then during the year, maybe mid-year, for example, or more often, the manager and subordinate meet periodically to review the subordinate's performance relative to actually attaining the goals. At the end of the year, a more formal meeting is scheduled during which the actual degree of goal attainment is addressed at the very end of the year. Okay, so there can be rating errors in performance appraisal that we need to be aware of. One of those would be a contrast error. This occurs when people are compared against one another instead of against an objective standard. So like I mentioned before, we have to be careful about this in performance appraisals. You don't look at each other, you look at the standard that you defined for that job that you're rating the performance of that employee for. And that's what you're doing instead of having a contrast error occur. A distributional error occurs when a rater tends to use only one part of the rating scale. Different types of this may be severity. This is a distributional error which occurs when the manager gives low ratings to all employees by holding them to an unreasonably high standard. Another type is leniency. This is the opposite of severity. Leniency occurs when a manager assigns relatively high or lenient ratings to all employees. Or there could be a central tendency, so managers tend to rate all employees average, using only the middle part of the rating scale. So those are distributional errors. There are also other types of rating errors in performance appraisal, just like in interviews. One is a halo error. This occurs when one positive performance characteristic causes a manager to rate all aspects of performance positively. So just like in an interview, if there's one positive characteristic of an applicant causing the manager or hiring manager to rate all other aspects not performance, but of the interview positively, the same type of thing can occur in the performance appraisal process with a halo error. The opposite of the halo error is the horn error. Again, this can happen in interviews as well. This occurs when the manager downgrades other aspects of an employee's performance because of a single performance dimension. Next, we're going to discuss what's known as contextual performance. These are tasks an employee does on the job that are not required as part of the job, but they still benefit the organization in some way. They're known as organizational citizenship behaviors. They include the willingness to stay late at work to finish deadlines, help coworkers get their work done, or performing tasks that benefit the general good of the organization. The question is, how important in determining the overall ratings are these types of behaviors? How important are these behaviors when we're going to be evaluating a person's or an employee's performance? So a recent study indicates although they are important behaviors, they may not be as important as work behaviors. That means they're not as important as productive behaviors in the workplace that actually help the specific employee's performance as opposed to helping others. So how should we go about evaluating the usefulness of the performance appraisal process? Well, some firms, I'm not going to say most, but at least in my knowledge, some firms have claimed to have dropped performance appraisal since the usage of stacked ratings. Stacked ratings are just forced distribution method, that forced distribution method which we discussed earlier. Some of it has led to backstabbing, low feelings of teamwork when we have forced distribution ratings. Remember when we just talked about this, it was when a certain percentage of employees had to be rated below average, some had to be rated at average or standard, and some had to be rated above. So that forced distribution can result in low employee morale. It also results in feelings of frustration. As someone above average might be rated as a poor performer, and that can definitely be negative. New performance management technologies enable the collection of real-time performance data that's presumably less prone to traditional biases and errors. However, not everyone is convinced that eliminating performance appraisals is the answer. So, like any other subject in human resources, there are issues pertaining to performance appraisal that affect the process legally. One of those would be that appraisals showing evidence of disparate impact must be validated in the same manner as any selection technique. So the organization has to demonstrate that this is job related, that the raters can observe rated behaviors, and the raters receive training to help them appraise performance better in order to reduce the disparate impact or to validate that the disparate impact is indeed legal. And now we're going to talk about career management. We're moving away from the performance appraisal process and moving towards career management. What is a career? A career is a set of experiences and activities that people engage in related to their job and livelihood over the course of their working life. So this includes specific jobs performed by a person, responsibilities and activities that constitute the job, movement and transition between jobs, and an individual's overall assessment of and feelings of satisfaction with the various components of his or her career. There are various stages in careers, and we're going to look at a traditional model for career stages. This suggests that a typical individual progresses through 4 career stages. One would be exploration. This involves identifying interests and opportunities. This may be in somebody's late teens to late 20s. Sometimes people take their first jobs in particular fields, and then they discover that they're not what they expected, and so they begin to look for alternative options. Others are satisfied to find their first job assignments. They find them exciting, and they are just what they expected them to be. Establishment involves creating a meaningful and relevant role to the organization. This can be the stage that occurs typically in the late 20s to mid-30s. Maintenance involves optimizing talents or capabilities. The individual begins to reach a level in the organization that optimizes their talents or capabilities. They become a mid-career plateau can occur. They must often devote extra effort and energy to learning new job skills and remain content to their professional skills and abilities. Also, they start mentoring newcomers. And disengagement involves the individual gradually beginning to pull away from work in the organization. The work may become less important and priorities change. Some may cut back into part-time work, some retire, some simply cut back on their activities and accomplishments. Older workers and the decision to retire. Some studies have found that curvilinear relationships exist between age and performance. So that means that performance is highest when workers are youngest and then when they are older. Individuals are most likely to retire when they have adequate financial resources available, and health makes it difficult to continue to work. Individuals may face many problems adjusting to retirement. Many people tend to continue with some type of bridge work, and these people generally adjust well to retirement. This chart shows us individual and organizational perspectives on career planning. The important point here is that both the organization and the individual are part of the process in career planning. It is not just one or the other. In terms of the organization needs to work to achieve good person-organization fit through selection, and then thus the effective career planning can result in stronger and a more effective workforce. For the individual, they need to understand and monitor career opportunities, successes, and failures, and then they can be more successful and have a healthier career. And next, we'll talk about steps in career planning. First, we would look at individuals assessing their own abilities, competencies, skills, and goals. Then the organization specifies career paths and opportunities. Organizations communicate the career paths and integrate their performance management system with their career management system. And then line managers or HR managers provide career counseling. So this involves interaction between an individual employee or manager in the organization and either a line manager or HR manager. It typically involves frank and open dialogue with the goal of making sure that the organization's assessment of the individual's role and their work prospects in the organization are congruent. So make sure that what they're interested in doing, there are opportunities for that in the organization. Sometimes that doesn't happen and the person maybe end up looking in other areas. But when they can, they will try to integrate the person's career interests with a career path in the organization, especially if it's a good employee. Regarding career development issues and challenges, in terms of career counseling programs, they address a wide variety of career-related issues, and they're readily accessible to people in the organization. Some are formal, some are informal. If they're formal, they tend to be workshops, conferences, and career development centers. The organization may even establish a general purpose career counseling program that's available to all employees, or create targeted programs for certain categories of employees, such as those that want to become supervisors. Informal career counseling programs are basically one-on-one interactions between employees and their supervisors, and it typically occurs during the performance appraisal period, where they're going to look at skills development, promotional prospects, other issues, or the employee may simply drop by human resources. Then there's dual career and work-family issues. There's concern over family-friendly work practices, balancing the family needs with work demands, connectedness between work stress and family stress. Evidence suggests that work stressors influence family stress, which in turn is related to long-term health. As the workforce becomes more diverse, organizations will have to recognize that both dual career issues and concerns over work-family balance will become increasingly important factors for determining career success. It must be considered as part of career management. And finally, in terms of evaluating career management activities, career management activities can be judged only by their success at any one point in time. So if an employee is satisfied with their career at a particular point, or at this point, their career management must be judged successful at that point. So successful management of one's career depends on the employee's efforts, or depends heavily on the employee's efforts to assess his or her own abilities and interests accurately and formulate a plan for whatever a successful career should look like. And with this, we end Chapter 10.